Welcome to Free the Mind, Free the People, a podcast where we come together to empower each other through knowledge and discuss the issues that shape our everyday lives. All opinions and information shared in this podcast are held by the host alone and do not represent the stances of the University of Central Florida and the Department of Sociology.
Speak the truth to the people. Talk sense to the people. Free them with reason, free them with honesty. Free the people with love and courage for their being. Spare them the fantasy, fantasy enslaves.
Hi everyone, welcome to our new episode of Free the Mind, Free the People, where we are going to discuss intellectual activism. I'm Hallie Spencer.
And I'm Marina Rivera.
The poem you just heard is called Speak Truth to the People, written by Mari Evans, featured in her 1970s book of poems called I'm a Black Woman. She's a poet and artist associated with the Black arts movement. This poem is our inspiration for our discussion on intellectual activism today, as posed by Patricia Hill Collins in her article, Truth-Telling and Intellectual Activism, which will be linked in the episode bio if you'd like to read more about it.
Yes. So before we get into the bigger discussion of this episode, we do want to contextualize Mari Evans' words. In this poem, she is speaking specifically about freeing the mind of Black people to build united and prosperous communities. So we want to be careful as we use her words to not take away to what she was speaking to. We're both non-Black women, and we do acknowledge that we have a privilege that Black women and other people of color don't have in this platform. So we want to make sure that we are centering their voices and not misrepresenting or appropriating their words. So in this case, we wanted to first connect Mari Evans' words about empowering people through knowledge and truth to the purpose of this podcast and how her words inspired this project as a whole. Actually, the title is inspired by this poem. So yeah, we want to base our conversation about intellectual activism, which is a topic for this episode, specifically both based on the poem by Mari Evans and Patricia Hill Collins' work.
Right. This poem was huge to us when creating our podcast, so we wanted to make sure we focus on where it came from and how we will move forward with what this poem was talking about. And as Evans and Collins argue, there is freedom and power within truly understanding our place within the structures of society. Understanding ourselves and our relationship to American history is an important first step for understanding the world we live in, which is our goals as sociologists. And sociologists for centuries have been working to interpret and comprehend society and see how it will progress forward. For example, Karl Marx, as we all know, attempted to eliminate income and class inequalities. Weber discussed how education, class, and wealth create a hierarchy. W.E.B. Du Bois studied inequalities in health and social outcomes for Black Americans. Harriet Martineau placed women in a more central role in the political economy and society. And Ida B. Wells documented lynching in the US and played a large part in both the civil rights movement and the women's suffrage movement. And these are all sociologists that we base the foundation of our knowledge on. And as we can see, sociology of a science is chock full of scholars engaging in intellectual activism. And to us, that is what's most important. So when we do intellectual activism, we are pushing for a more just society. And that is the very founding principle as sociology as a science.
Yeah, and all of those names that we just mentioned, we will be discussing those scholars in the future, but all of them were involved in sociology, and their words and their work has inspired a lot of our motivation with this podcast and the future topics of this podcast. So now that we've introduced Mari Evans and we've talked a little bit about intellectual activism, we want to actually get into describing intellectual activism. So keeping in mind Mari Evans' words, truth-telling is a tool that has been put forth by more modern scholars like Patricia Hill Collins. As a Black woman in academia, Collins speaks about her unique position as what she calls an outsider within, which means that she is both privileged because she's within academia, but also marginalized because she is a Black woman in predominantly white academia. So she wrote a book called Untitled Activism, and she describes intellectual activism as when scholarship is oriented towards social justice. So intellectual activism is mainly composed of two approaches, which we will define for you. First, speaking truth to power, and then speaking truth to people.
Right. So these two aspects of speaking truth to power and speaking truth to people are foundational to all of intellectual activism. So in her work, she describes the necessity for intellectual activists to partake in both of these. And when speaking truth to power, that means that one confronts the power structures from within. And sociologist C. Wright Mills defines the power elite as those who occupy the dominant positions within dominant institutions of dominant countries. And these institutions can include the military, the economy, politics, and education. The decisions made by those in power have enormous consequences on our everyday lives and our decisions. So that's why it's important to confront those in power. However, on the flip side, speaking truth to people involves engaging directly with a collective of people outside of the power structures. So in her view, people who are not in power must be given the truth to make decisions for their own lives. And that's what we're doing, speaking truth to people, talking to you guys, so you guys can become more knowledgeable and make decisions for yourself. But once the collective has this information and they speak with each other and create coalitions, they can eventually confront the power structures themselves as a wider group, which can create bigger change than if just one person tried to confront the power structure.
Right, exactly. So definitely this podcast is somewhat of a version of speaking truth to people, and also speaking truth to power, but we'll get more into that later. So now we wanted to give some examples of speaking truth to power and speaking truth to people. So first, speaking truth to power really involves using the tools, resources, and ideas of the powerful by insiders of that system to challenge the system itself. Some examples would include how Patricia Hill Collins, her as an outsider within, she was able to use the scholarship and the way that she learned sociology in academia to write about gender, race, sexuality, and challenge the truths that had been established by the dominant group in academia, which have been white men for the most part. So she basically challenges how and why these truths were determined by the powerful in institutions like academia. So one foundational idea is that whatever is portrayed as knowledge within academia and as truth or as facts, a lot of the time they are from the perspective of the powerful. So speaking truth to power actually challenges those perspectives and that dominant narrative within academia.
Right. And there's a really great example of this going on at UCF right now that we're involved in. And that is the creation of a critical race theory class in the sociology department, which is taught by Dr. Cox, who will be our first guest interviewee on our next episode, but we will get into that later.
Yeah.
Anyways, Dr. Cox teaches this class on critical race theory. And this is an institutional means to gain understanding about racism and its structures within society. And with higher education being a largely white, male, upper class arena, having a critique of the system that's foundation is within academic theory is a way to use the tools of those in power, which is an exciting advancement because now we are talking about something that people in power 100 years ago would not want us to talk about. However, when we talk about activism, speaking truth to power versus speaking truth to people, this is just one facet of it. This is just the speaking truth to power side, so it shouldn't just end there.
Yeah, and going back to what speaking truth to power is, even we as academics in our own research, the topics that you and I are interested in, that is speaking truth to power, because we are both interested in social inequalities and just understanding more how these structures of power work in our society and how we can address them. So the other side of this is speaking truth to people. Our podcast is also a way to speak truth to people because we are reaching out to people beyond academia and pointing them to the structures of power and trying to make sociology understandable, not to just those who are outside of sociology, but outside of university academia as a whole. So the purpose of this is to hopefully, because we're pointing them to these structures of power, we can empower people to challenge those structures of power. And so this process also, according to Mari Evans' words, it takes talking reason to people, but with honesty, love, courage, and care. And we'll get more into what those words mean specifically in this context. But those words are foundational in our approach while speaking truth to people.
Right. And speaking truth to people is so important. It seems like very obvious, but it's like extremely foundational, because for people to make change, they first have to recognize what is going on around them. And that basically is what sociology studies. And so people might not even recognize the structures that they're within because they've just been surrounded by their whole lives that they don't even realize that they're in it. And so the reason that speaking truth to people is so important is because it's rarely been used by academics and those in power. Powerful people usually only talk to other powerful people. And the ability for academics and people in power to speak to other people, these avenues have intentionally been cut off to keep the masses in the dark so they can't challenge the system. So it's kind of a cycle of academics don't really have access to speaking to other people, so then they don't speak to other people, and then it just is just people in their towers, powerful people just talking to each other, which means no knowledge is being given to those who really, really need it.
Yeah, and a thing to also consider, at least those of us that are within academia, we know how difficult it is for us to reach out to people, not necessarily because we don't want to, but because the academia itself doesn't prioritize it.
Yeah.
We are told to publish, we're told to collaborate with other academics, we're told to go to conferences, but all of this is what's seen as profitable and marketable within academia. And I understand its value. I've been to conferences and yeah, like I enjoy them. But I think that there is also the issue that the academia itself as an institution is not prioritizing sociologists who actually go out and speak truth to people. And I would even say that it's because it's almost like a liability. Like if we go out and become involved in activism, for example, which we will give some examples of academics that have done that. But my point is that it's not necessarily seen as something that's safe for institutions and academics.
Right, because as we discussed, education, and especially higher education, is an institution of the powerful. And so they probably know this, and that's why they're like gatekeeping it, but they're giving us the tools to also overcome this power system. And they don't want us to give this power to other people. And so like journals, we post journals, which anyone can read, right? No, it's behind a paywall. And then we go to conferences that people could go to, right? No, you have to be a member of this organization, or you have to be invited. Like there are steps that keep people out from it, and it's so they don't use our own knowledge against us. And I think, like you said, that is their biggest fear, is that they don't want us turning against them in any way, because they are a powerful institution that creates the knowledge that we use, and they don't want us to use our own knowledge against them.
Yeah. And I guess one last thing to that point is a lot of these things are not done intentionally. They might not be thinking, we are going to keep academics from the public because we want to keep this special knowledge. A lot of the time it is not intentional. But the structure within which academia is, how things work within academia, is what leads to that. It results in that, even if the powerful are not actively thinking or trying to keep knowledge from people. So after all of that, we do want to talk about some critiques of intellectual activism, and it does connect to this idea of the powerful being within their own community. So
yeah, so while intellectual activism is a process we hope to use, we understand that there needs to be a balance between speaking truth to power and speaking truth to people, and that is hard for us to maintain because we are academics. I mean, even like as we were creating this podcast, I was like, oh no, this is going to take time. Am I going to be able to write this journal that only other academics are going to read, that like no one else will be able to read? And I had to remind myself that this is important for other reasons. And so Collins mentions that speaking truth to power usually comes from people already within institutions. And this is where like the main critique comes in, because there is this idea of using the tools of the powerful, and this is often critiqued. And while these tools of the powerful could create freedom for those with less power, that means we are essentially upholding the system by using the tools of the powerful. And this is a discussion we regularly have in our sociology classes about, is it okay to use the tools of the powerful to hopefully create more power for those that do not have it? And that is a question that I struggle with sometimes too, is it okay to use these tools?
Yeah, that is a valid critique. Going back to the fact that a lot of the knowledge within academia doesn't make it out of academia. But I mean, going to the point of the question about whether we should use those tools or not, I think personally, I believe that as sociologists, we do have this struggle between sticking with the science and being objective. And I put all those in quotations because there is no such thing as objectivity. And as sociologists, we understand that and we take that seriously. Our position as sociologists influences our experiences, where we come from will always influence how we interpret things and the approach that we use when we are studying certain topics. So there's that, but also there's the idea that if you do take a stance in whatever you're studying, then that creates bias in your research and in the knowledge that you're producing. And once again, the bias will always be there, but I do think that using sociology and stopping at the findings of your research instead of trying to actually get involved in the world and society and trying to change things with that knowledge, that is upholding the system. You're not critiquing anything, you're not challenging anything, you're just using the tools, yes, but not to change society. You're not using it to give back to the community within which you created your study. You're taking, but you're not giving back. And so to me, that's upholding the system. However, in terms of what Patricia Hill Collins is talking about, she is an outsider within, which provides her with a different view of things. And she does use her scholarship in a subversive way to empower those outside of institutions as well. So she does both. She uses her scholarship as both speaking truth to power, because she challenges those institutions through her work, but also she speaks to people because she shares this knowledge from her perspective as an outsider within, that can help empower people and bridge that gap between academics and non-academics. So going back to speaking truth to people from the outside, like in the outside, or outside of academia, speaking to the people outside of academia allows them to apply more pressure than we could, arguably. I mean, if we are within the institution, we are employed by the institution, we have more stakes within the institution. So it can be more powerful to share this knowledge to other people that are outside of the academia that can inflict that pressure on the institution that we can't necessarily.
Right, exactly. And I kind of wanted to go back to what you said about, like, if you don't do something with your work, then that is upholding the system and using like the power's tools. Because I mean, I don't like the idea of we study something for years. Like, we are working so hard on this and we're just supposed to give it out to someone else to then do something with. Like, it's not the best way to get rid of bias within studying is to just recognize it and know that we all have it, and then to work from there. And I feel like it's hard to be the person that spent all these years working on it and then just kind of give it up to someone to then make a difference with. And it's hard to understand as an academic that that is still part of your job, is to, like, you're supposed to do something with the knowledge you create. And that's extremely important to keep it moving. And that happened a lot within some examples in real life of when intellectual activism formed from academics and communities working together, was the activism surrounding environmental racism and environmental injustice. And so for a long time, people thought that, like, the environment affected everyone equally, and climate change affected us equally. And so the way that the climate affects me is the same way that someone across the globe affects them. However, it was found by academics that that's not true. And in fact, scholarly articles and research found that Black communities were being targeted the most for dumping of toxic waste, and that Black people face the biggest harms of environmental hazards. And so this discovery within academia was then sparked a movement within Black communities to protect themselves from hazardous facilities and companies in the area. And this couldn't have been done without the work of academics and also them releasing their knowledge to the public. And this change with environmental racism and this movement that created healthier communities, this change that was created could not have been done without the work of communities. So it really was hand in hand of academics gaining this knowledge and then working together with communities to finally create the overall change.
Right. And another example, which somewhat overlaps, because environmental activists were part of this movement, but if anybody listening has heard of the Occupy Wall Street movement, Occupy Wall Street was a movement back in 2011 that involved environmental activists. It involved labor unionists. It involved students, college students. So it involved a lot of people. And they were basically challenging, because at the time the housing market crashed and there was that whole, it had been going on for years now. So they were challenging corporations and the idea of the tax burden being on the poor and tax cuts for the rich. So this whole movement was possible not just because of the mobilization of students and labor unions and all these other activists, but also professors were there and quote unquote academics, intellectuals were there, and their work, while the work of people like Dr. Cornel West and Dr. David Graeber, who passed away in 2020, both of them were very influential and participated in the Occupy Wall Street movement. And even though, for example, Dr. Graeber, his ethnographic work was on communities in Madagascar, which sounds really random, but really far away from the US. But he basically talked about this anarchist efforts among that community in which the state had abandoned them, and communities came together without a state and an official state, and they empowered each other and they started to provide for each other, for themselves. And so in this case, while his scholarship didn't directly influence Occupy Wall Street, there were parallels between the dynamic, specifically because Occupy Wall Street was a highly decentralized movement. It was against the state. It was against hierarchy. So it was widespread, and it challenged a lot of the things that community in Madagascar did. So that's another example where academia and non-academics came together and created some social change.
That's a really interesting connection between like his study in Madagascar and the roots of occupying Wall Street kind of overlapping in what their movement stood for. That's just really interesting to hear about.
Oh, and apparently, y'all can fact check me on this, but I did read that he was one of the major people that coined the term "we are the 99%."
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so he was like on the forefront of that movement.
Yeah, that's like, I feel like if people don't know exactly what Occupy Wall Street is, they've definitely heard about the 99% and the 1%, even if they have no idea what the movement was about. So that's really cool. But in terms of like intellectual activism, right now we're talking about like a lot of academics and then like very activist-centered movements. And I fear that the term intellectual activism can seem out of reach for non-academics and people who are strongly within activism. But intellectual activism should be used by everyone to be successful. And we want people who are not academics and not intense activists to still be involved. Because when we discuss knowledge, it usually seems to be coming from an institution and research, but in fact, the knowledge of a community member and the knowledge they have about their lived experiences is also extremely important to how we will make community change. And speaking truth to people, I think it also involves the aspect of allowing people to talk back to us as like academics, and then us also listening to them and making sure that what we do has a basis from what the community actually needs from us and how we can work together to create that change. And this approach is actually known as community-based participatory research. And it is like one of the main methods of integrating insights of research academics with community leaders and the needs that they've identified as academics can help with.
Yeah, so community-based participatory research is definitely, it goes back to what you were saying in our introductory episode about knowledge being beyond the walls of academia. And so in this, when we practice community-based participatory research, we are relying on community members to be our teachers and our educators, instead of us going into those communities and imposing our knowledge or trying to come up with solutions based on what we've seen from the outside, but rather basing ourselves on their knowledge and what they know is best for their communities.
Right, because they are ultimately the stakeholders in our research. Whatever we create will be what impacts them. So to go in there, do a bunch of research and then leave and then make a journal article about them without any of their participation, we are putting out things that does not directly represent them at all. And so whatever conclusions we come to, we have to go back to the community and be like, hey, does this help you? Is this true? Do you feel like this stands true for the community that you live in? Because they are ultimately the ones that are affected by it. We might be able to put a journal out there and say we posted something, but they are ultimately the ones that are affected by the research that we do. And so it's important to keep that communication open throughout like all points of the process in research.
Right.
So as we've discussed all this, we kind of introduced ways that it's been used now, but we should talk more about why we think intellectual activism is important and why we should continue doing it.
Yeah, so as most of us have witnessed, the public is divided. We are very divided. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of distrust of experts and spread of misinformation. And so those are some of the things that have demanded of us to speak truth to people. And as Mari Evans said, we need to free people with reason, but also with love, with care and courage. So in this current political environment, it does take courage to speak truth to power. And especially, and we will give some more in-depth examples of this later on. But right now, there is an active effort of silencing educators and the topics that they can discuss within academia and all the way to elementary school. So that is really compelling us to reach out to the public in this moment.
Yeah, I feel like it's especially important right now to focus a lot of our attention on speaking truth to people, especially because I feel like in general, we focus a lot more on speaking truth to power, and then we get frustrated when nothing comes from it. Like right now, we have unprecedented access to political leaders through social media and other technologies like Twitter, and we take a lot of our time trying to reach them through there, which is important, but I fear that nothing really changes when we do that. Because like when former President Trump would make like a dumb comment on Twitter, we would all run to our phones, quote tweet it, and say some quip making him feel dumb. And then we'd sit back and we'd be all smug and be like, yeah, look what we just did. How like this funny tweet just like making fun of Trump or getting back at him. And in reality, I don't think that did as much as we think it did. It made us feel good when we did it, but I don't think it created the change that we actually need. And I think it's a false sense of action. And I think more could come from us talking to our community, spending our time online, talking to power, maybe change that to spending time online, talking to people within our communities or people who are interested in the same topics that we're interested in. And that will ultimately build a coalition. And when we then do decide to speak to power, it won't be through the form of a tweet or something like that. It will be a form of a movement or a protest or us collectively doing something to speak to power. And then that will create more of a change, hopefully.
Exactly. And so in terms of social media, I know that personally, I always am posting things online, and I do reckon I have seen the limits of that firsthand. Like, it feels like I'm preaching to the choir, as they say. Like, most people in my social media agree to an extent. Not all, but so that's why I still post.
Yeah.
Because, I want to reach to people that have different perspectives as me and do have me on social media. But I do recognize that social media can become what people call an echo chamber, where you're only surrounded by people that share your views. That's how the algorithm ends up working. And so beyond that, whatever we're saying doesn't really have an impact unless you're like a public figure and you have like a huge platform. But yes, so in terms of just us members of communities, it would be best, like you were saying, to speak directly to the people in our communities and get together and organize in our communities.
And I like that you mentioned that it's still important to, talk to people who don't agree with us, because right now, I think we've all felt this like overwhelming anger against people we disagree with, especially when it's through like important topics like getting vaccinated and like our political affiliations and like racism and sexism. It's easy to really like villainize these people because we disagree with them. However, it's important that the people we disagree with, while we think their opinions are wrong, it's because they are getting this information from the people in power. They are the outcome of certain propagandas that are being put out by those in power. And these people who are creating the propaganda are hoping to divide us. And so when they divide us, we are yelling at each other. We're just getting mad at each other. We never create connections with them. And that's what they're hoping for. They want this division to exist between those who are not in power so that we can't figure out how to talk to and challenge the people that are actually in power. And I think it's hard to talk to people that we disagree with because it's upsetting, but it's important to recognize that those connections are important. And it's less about us fighting about the right versus the left and more about us fighting up versus down. So that means the people who are in power versus the people who are not in power.
Yes, exactly. And on the topic of vaccination specifically, I have seen and I've been part of the conversation of that whole topic with people that I disagree with. And an important thing to remember is the fact that if we look into it, the majority of the people that are in power, that means not the people that are our neighbors that we disagree with, but the people that are politicians and community leaders, they have been vaccinated.
Yeah.
And they are also on the forefront of anti-vaccine rhetoric. So, and also a lot of the data has shown that the people that are dying from COVID are mostly marginalized communities and poor people and people of lower educational attainment. So that just shows that what the people that are actually ultimately getting impacted by this are not those in power. Right. And so when we engage in conversations with people about this topic, we need to remember that they may support those in power, but they are not those in power specifically.
Right.
The powerful are already doing their thing.
Right. Like the powerful, they're protected. They are out here being vaccinated while telling other people not to get vaccinated and then being sad when their supporters are passing away from COVID. And online during like the height of COVID, there were a lot of posts, people reposting maybe a tweet or a Facebook comment of an anti-vaxxer saying like, oh, anti-vax is horrible, or getting vaccinated is bad, don't do it, 5G, I don't know, like all that stuff. And then months later, they'll learn that this person passed away, and a lot of people online will make fun of them. But ultimately, in that case, I view that person as a victim of propaganda. While not getting vaccinated was extremely dangerous for a lot of people, and it's important to get vaccinated, the person who passed away because they didn't get vaccinated is a victim of this propaganda. And it is the powerful making sure that the less powerful cannot think past that. Like they are only thinking about vaccinations and nothing else. And then they're the ones who unfortunately passed away from COVID and not getting vaccinated. And ultimately we can't make fun of them and call them idiots. I think we should view them as like they are a victim and an outcome of those in power not caring about us.
Yes. This division that is being created by powerful people, this is also called divide and conquer in warfare, but it also applies to politics. And also it reminds me of a book that I read called How Fascism Works by Dr. Jason Stanley, and he's a professor of philosophy at Yale. And he talks about the us versus them in fascism, and how creating this, and by the way, his family were refugees from Nazi Germany, so they were Jewish. And so he focuses on the fact that in America right now, in the United States, there is this myth of America, of the great America that once was and now isn't because of people of color. And so that narrative allows the powerful to divide people and basically turn people of color as a scapegoat, as an excuse for whatever societal issues we're facing. And it also it's also based on what Jason Stanley calls unreality. And unreality is just this idea of a distortion of reality, because to fit the narrative of the people in power and to confuse people and to mislead them. So that is what makes it a bit more difficult for people, or for all of us, to see that dynamic between the powerful and the rest of us and address the issue, like you said, not against each other, but against those at the top. So yes, they don't just use division, they use confusion. And so this is why speaking truth to people is also relevant right now. Some examples, some more specific examples of this tactic has been the recent banning of CRT, critical race theory. And here in Florida, that is partly supported by what is called the Stop Woke Act by our governor, Ron DeSantis. And so in this case, the excuse really is we have to protect children from learning about race and feeling bad about being white and stuff like that, which is a misrepresentation of critical race theory. Critical race theory is not actually on the curriculum for most elementary schools. It is mostly used in higher education. And so it creates this smoke screen, or this false image of what critical race theory, so that now everything that is race, that talks about race, is critical race theory. So through this effort, they don't just ban critical race theory, which doesn't exist in elementary school, but they also ban any conversation about race as a whole, which is kind of important when we are discussing history, like slavery and Jim Crow, the Holocaust, etc.
Right.
And so another example is the Don't Say Gay bill, which passed here recently in Florida. And again, it's just a ban on talking about sexual orientation, gender identity in the classroom, and under the guise, again, of protecting the children. So again, these are just ways in which, and by the way, critical race theory we are providing links below to all of this. It has already been attacked in 37 states. Bills have been either introduced or passed to ban critical race theory. So it is something that is currently under attack, and that in general just includes all educators. All educators, education, higher education, and elementary through high school is being threatened by people in power because they are taking advantage of this division and this confusion that they've created among people.
Right. And it's so weird to me, the argument on both of these cases about, like protecting the children when we're discussing race and gender identity. But like, which children are they trying to protect?
Right.
Like, they're like, they're trying to protect like the white male straight students because they don't want them to feel uncomfortable speaking about races and sexualities and genders other than their own. But it would be extremely beneficial to some students who are Black or are women or are gay to talk about their experiences at a young age so they don't think they're different or wrong. Like, identity is huge, and children realize their identity before adults might even want them to, and discussing that is extremely important. And it is extremely beneficial for kids to be able to discuss what's going on around them and what they're feeling. And so when they talk about protecting the children, what we're really talking about is white children and male children and straight children, so that then we can uphold this institution of power, which is largely white, straight, and male. So it's very frustrating to hear the argument that we have to protect the children. Like, okay.
Yes, we people of color are not protected from talking about race. You as a Jewish woman have not been protected from talking about the Holocaust or anti-Semitism. We have not had that choice. So it is important that we're all on the same page, I think.
Absolutely. And ultimately, this idea of like smoke screens is so that they can stay in power. Like, that's their goal when they do these things, is so that people of marginalized identities cannot make it up the rungs of power and then change their institution. So it is basically smoke screens that we are arguing amongst each other rather than working together to fight the power.
Exactly. And uniting, so just to contextualize unity a bit more, is unity is not necessarily covering the issues that divide us or the ways in which we act and affect each other and harm each other, that is not unity. Unity involves speaking truth to power together. And for that, we all have to face how we are contributing to those in power and how we are contributing to the harm of other people. So unity is not a word that we in this podcast are using for people to remain comfortable in the things that they do or say that could be harming others. We are talking about coming together against those powers. And that will take us facing how we are contributing to those issues.
And I want to add that when we are talking to people we disagree with, like, we have to remember that we're all just like humans, like we might disagree on these topics that are important, and it's easy to villainize each other, but we're all just hoping for what's best for ourselves and for each other. And so like for a while I worked as a canvasser and a political canvasser. So I'd go to neighborhoods and I'd ring doorbells and I'd say, hey, can I talk to you about affordable housing? And there was no way for me to know whether this person agreed with me on topics, whether we agreed all the way on a lot of things. In fact, sometimes I knew we didn't agree on most things based on the information I got. But you can find these overarching things that people agree on no matter what their political ideation is. Like, oh, do you care about affordable housing? Yes, most people care about affordable housing. Do you care about the education? Yes, we care about education. So like finding those just like core values of just like humans in general is extremely important to making these steps to connect. And when you create this basis of, okay, I care about these certain topics, you can then grow the conversation to things that maybe you don't disagree with, but you'll recognize that you're both humans, you both are affected by certain forms of information, which might give you guys different ideas, but you can still talk through those in a safe way if they are not being outwardly racist or sexist towards you. Like at some point, if the conversation goes badly, you can step away. But the core understanding is that we're both human beings and we both want to be okay living right now. And like, that's the ultimate goal. And so when you frame it as that is our ultimate goal, then more people can come along and these discussions become a lot more mobilizing. A lot of people will realize that they agree on more things than they think when you just come at it as we are humans trying to get on in this world. And that makes it a lot easier. And that's where the idea of love kind of comes into this, where Mari Evans talked about freeing people with love. And the word unity and love can be like very mystifying when discussing activism and just in general. Like, what does love mean? Like, how can someone even do this? And that was that is why we're talking about this, because there's a different definition of love that we are talking about. And Bell Hooks discussed this in one of her books called All About Love. And basically she defines it not as a feeling, but it's defined as an intention and an action. And love in this case is multifaceted, and it has aspects of respect, recognition, care, and most importantly to us, accountability and responsibility. And Collins says to, in quotes, love them in ways that empower and not demean, show the courage to try something radically different, and express a level of basic care. And when we come to these discussions with a level of basic care and courage and accountability, that is what makes our activism move forward in directions that maybe some people didn't go before. And so that this idea of love is not just, some random idea thrown out there. Love has a very strict theoretical definition, and that theoretical definition can now be used in our actions moving forward.
Right. And of course, while we are creating or trying to create a space for social change with love and unity, we do understand that there are difficulties that we all will face in that, and just in showing love to people that we disagree with. But going back to the definition, loving them is to try to stand up for others and to show them how they are hurting others. Like that is how a part of showing love to people and to our communities while we are engaging in these conversations trying to create social change.
And right, so like if we use the term love at all through this episode or in the future, do not take it as your preconception of love being this affectionate feeling. That is not what we mean by love. Redefine love in your head as this action of accountability and responsibility and care and recognition. And that is what we mean moving forward when we use that word. Because I think we've all, anyone who is listening who has come into activism or has felt things that upset them, we often come into creating social change with anger inside of us because we are so frustrated with what's going on. And while that is helpful and it can be helpful, it ultimately can burn us out very, very quickly. And so if we burn out quickly, then we ultimately cannot make the changes that we hope to. And so while anger is overwhelming, love can be all encompassing. And so anger can just burn out quite quickly, and love can kind of take us throughout the entire movement. And hopefully that means we can fight for justice for as long as possible.
Right. And I think that finding a way to care for ourselves in that process, because obviously anger is something that takes away from you at times. It can be exhausting. And so it is important to find a way to care for ourselves and for each other as we engage in activism. But I do want to make a point that sometimes anger is thought of as a negative thing, specifically when it comes to activists of color. So anger in and of itself is, as I view it, is a response to injustice. It's not something that we need to get rid of or something. So we should care for ourselves, of course, but we should also acknowledge that anger and channel it to create social change. And there is this idea of self-love or like self-care in the mainstream, where it's like, just treat yourself, you know?
Do a face mask, take a bath.
Go for a hike.
Yeah.
But activists and scholars like Audre Lorde talked about, specifically in her book, A Burst of Light, she talks about how she says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. And she calls it political warfare because for marginalized people who have systemically suffered because of the way that things are set up by the powerful to benefit the powerful, it is not expected of them to be able to fight back because they're already dealing with all these other things. But so in that case, when people of color and other marginalized people choose to take care of themselves and to preserve their health and their well-being to fight against the powerful, that is destructive to the system that they've set up. So that is why it's kind of like a political, an act of political warfare.
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to make the point to say that anger is completely valid and it's not a negative thing. And we feel this anger because we love our communities. And basically, this anger comes from our love of ourselves and those around us. And it's completely justified and it exists because of our love. And like I mentioned before, it's not a feeling of affection, but it's a feeling of care and it's a feeling of responsibility and respect and commitment. And so when we use our love alongside of our anger, we can create a lot of this change that we were hoping for. And it's important for those things to like work together and that they ultimately are two sides of the same coin.
Right. Yeah. And just one last thing on that point is the fact that anger, if we acknowledge anger and we stop it, and if we take away the bias that is associated with anger, specifically for people of color. If we acknowledge that anger, it doesn't mean that we're going to use that anger as our main tool, like when we're trying to have conversations with people. I mean, we can't just be screaming all the time. But my point is that if we all create collectively, marginalized people and people that are not marginalized, privileged people, if we all collectively agree and acknowledge that anger has a root and the root is injustice, then we can actually make change and have those conversations. But if we continue to just see anger anytime we are speaking with somebody that is a victim of injustice, if that is all we focus on, then that's what can hinder the conversations. So it's kind of like making space for anger, but not using anger as your only fuel, because you will burn out.
Yeah, so exactly. That's a really good point.
Yeah, so I think that's everything I had on that. But so now talking about ourselves as students, podcasters, academics, public sociologists, activists, whatever we want to call ourselves, we want to recognize the need for this love and for this accountability to be at the center of everything that we do and every conversation that we have with our communities, especially at a time of division as right now. And so that is all. That is all we had for this conversation. Now I wanted to take a moment to announce the next episode. And the next episode is going to be on social theory and the marginalized social theories. And as Hallie mentioned previously, our special guest and first guest is Dr. Cox from the UCF Sociology Department. So in a few weeks, we hope to be able to share that with you, that conversation with you all. And stay tuned if you want to hear more.
Everyone, thank you.
Bye.
We'd also like to thank the University of Central Florida Department of Sociology for their generous support of this podcast.